The wind howled through the Andes like a mourning spirit, sweeping snow across jagged cliffs and bare rocks. Little Anka sat beneath a crooked tree, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her bare feet red and raw from the cold. At only 9 years old, she had no cloak, no fire, nothing but the woven cloth around her shoulders and the last warmth of hope fading from her chest. Her breath formed small clouds, vanishing as quickly as they came. She didn't understand why they left her, only that they had, and now the mountains around her offered only silence. Her tribe had marched on without her. She'd stumbled during the climb, her legs too weak, her fever too high. When she awoke, they were gone. She remembered her mother's eyes, how they didn't meet hers when she reached for her. She remembered the chief's voice. She will not survive the mountain. No one had argued. No one had looked back. Now she rocked gently, humming the lullaby her mother used to sing when they slept near the fire. Her voice cracked, barely louder than the wind. Each word felt like a goodbye. Each breath, a little slower than the last. Night fell fast in the highlands. Shadows stretched long, and the air grew colder than bone. Somewhere in the distance, a snow leopard called into the dark. Anka didn't flinch. She was no longer afraid. If the cold or the beasts came for her, so be it. But then, snow crunched. Her body tensed. A figure stepped through the trees, tall and wrapped in thick fur. A bow across his back, eyes sharp and unreadable. He said nothing, only stood there watching her. Anka stared, too frozen to speak. Then, slowly, the man took a step forward, and she dared to breathe. He didn't speak, just moved closer, one slow step at a time, like he didn't want to scare her. The snow barely crunched beneath his boots, his movements quiet, practiced. Anka watched him through wide, unblinking eyes. She should have been afraid. A stranger in the mountains meant danger, but something in the way he moved, cautious, gentle, made her hesitate. He knelt a few feet away, unhooked a water skin from his belt, and set it down before her. Then, still silent, he pushed it gently across the snow. She stared at it, then at him. He made no motion to leave or speak. Anka's fingers trembled as she reached out. Her body screamed from the cold, but the fear of another trick, another abandonment, kept her slow. The water touched her lips like a promise. Cold, real, life. She drank in small sips, never taking her eyes off the man. He watched, but didn't move. His face was hard, weathered, painted in the shadows of someone who'd lived too long with silence. Around his neck hung a small carved pendant, a jaguar, worn smooth from touch. When she finished drinking, she held it out. He didn't take it back. Instead, he pointed to her chest, then nodded once. She didn't understand at first, but when he reached into his pack and pulled out a thick fur cloak, everything shifted. He wrapped it gently around her shoulders, lifting her like she weighed nothing. She let out a small gasp but didn't resist. His arms were strong, his warmth immediate. As he stood, cradling her against his chest, she felt something break loose inside her, a fear, a weight. Her tribe had left her for dead, but this stranger, this silent hunter, carried her as if she mattered. As the wind screamed around them, she closed her eyes against his shoulder and did not cry. The man moved like a shadow through the snow, his step sure, his breath calm, even as the storm thickened. Anka clung to the fur against his chest, her face buried in the fabric, too weak to lift her head. Wind howled around them, sharp as knives, but he never slowed. She felt each step in his stride, the steady rhythm of boots on packed snow, the crunch and shift of earth beneath them. Somewhere deep inside her, something stirred, not strength, not yet, but the smallest flicker of safety. She didn't know where he was taking her. She only knew she was no longer alone. After what felt like hours, they reached a wall of jagged stone, half buried in snow. The man turned sideways, disappearing into a narrow crevice. Inside, the wind vanished. It was a small cave, dry and quiet, shielded by the mountain itself. He laid her down on furs beside a stack of wood and kindling. His hands moved swiftly, fire built with practiced ease, its warmth growing with each flicker. Shadows danced on the stone walls. Anka curled near the flames, watching him from the corner of her eye. He wasn't looking at her. He focused on survival, theirs, not just his own. She hadn't heard a voice in days, but when he finally spoke, it was low and soft, barely above the crackle of the fire. "You are Inca?" he asked. Anka hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Left behind?" Another nod. He didn't press further, just handed her a piece of dried meat and a folded blanket. She took it with shaking hands. For a moment, silence returned, heavy but not cruel. Then he spoke again. "I am Otto." Just that. A name. Something solid to hold on to. Anka opened her mouth, uncertain, then whispered her own name. Anka. And with that, something between them began. The fire crackled low as darkness thickened outside the cave, cloaking the mountains in pitch. Anka lay wrapped in the heavy fur Otto had given her, her small frame curled tightly, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Ato sat a short distance away, sharpening a stone blade with slow, rhythmic strokes. He hadn't spoken again, and yet the silence didn't frighten her. It felt steady. She studied him from beneath the blanket, his strong hands, his weathered face, the quiet strength in his stillness. He was unlike anyone she had ever known, and in the warmth of the firelight, she didn't feel abandoned anymore. As the wind whispered outside, memories crept in like shadows. Her mother's laugh, the way she used to braid Anka's hair by the fire, her father's carved spear, always leaning by the hut door. She had not cried when they left her, not then. But now, as safety settled around her, the ache in her chest cracked open. Tears welled up, silent and hot, tracing down her cheeks. She covered her face, ashamed. But then she felt something, not words, not touch, just warmth. Ato had pushed the fire closer with his stick, making it brighter. She looked up, and he nodded once. From his pouch, Ato pulled a small carved figure, a hummingbird, smooth and simple. He placed it gently beside her blanket and returned to his seat, saying nothing. Anka stared at it. Hummingbirds were sacred in her tribe, messengers of hope. Her hands closed around it slowly, like she wasn't sure it was real. She glanced at Ato, and though his face was unreadable, his eyes held something quiet understanding. She pressed the carving to her chest and lay back down. The fire popped softly. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cave, two souls, once strangers, now shared the same flame. Dawn seeped through the cave's narrow mouth, casting pale light on the stone walls. Anka opened her eyes to the sound of rustling. Ato was already awake, crouched near the fire, grinding dried maize into flour. His movements were quiet, efficient, a man used to surviving alone. She sat up slowly, the warmth of the fur still wrapped around her. He looked at her once, then nodded toward a small flat stone where he had begun baking a cake over the coals. The gesture was wordless, but clear. Food. For her. She scooted closer, drawn not just by hunger, but by presence. Throughout the day, Anka stayed near Otto, silently observing. He carved tools from bone, checked traps he had set along the mountain ridge, and returned with a rabbit slung over his shoulder. Every action had purpose, every movement, thought. He didn't explain what he was doing, he simply did it. But something about the way he allowed her to watch made her feel like she belonged. When he skinned the rabbit, she didn't look away. When he salted the meat, she leaned closer. And when he caught her trying to copy his nuts with a spare cord, he handed it to her without a word. That evening, after the meal, Anka practiced the knot again, tongue poking from the side of her mouth in concentration. Her fingers fumbled, but she kept trying. Ato watched from across the fire. After her fourth attempt, the loop finally held. She grinned, holding it up with pride. He didn't say anything, didn't need to, but the corner of his mouth twitched, just barely. A smile, faint but real. It was the first time she'd seen any emotion on his face. And somehow, that small sign of approval meant more to her than words ever could. She smiled back, heart quietly full. The next morning, the wind carried something different, not snow, not scent, but a feeling. Ato paused at the cave entrance, eyes narrowed toward the horizon. Anka sensed the change in him, the way his muscles tensed, the bow slung over his back just a little tighter. He crouched low, scanning the trail below. Then she saw it, two faint tracks in the snow, human, not animal. Her breath caught. Could it be her tribe? Had they returned? But Ato shook his head slowly. His voice was low. Not your people. Just 3 words. But the warning inside them felt heavy and cold. They moved quickly. Ato gathered their belongings, hiding signs of the cave's use. Anka helped as best she could, stuffing furs into a pouch, scattering ashes from the fire. He handed her a small sling and gestured toward the back of the cave, a hidden crevice barely large enough to crawl through. She understood. If danger came, she was to hide. Ato's calm never cracked, but his eyes had sharpened, scanning the wind like it whispered secrets. She wanted to ask who they were, the ones he feared. But something in her heart already knew men who take, not give. By nightfall, the cave was cold and silent. No fire, no warmth. Anka sat in the hidden crevice, wrapped in furs, the hummingbird carving clutched tightly in her palm. Ato stood near the cave entrance, still and silent, a shadow against the rock. Time stretched thin. Every sound outside, snapping twigs, shifting snow, made her breath still. But Ato didn't move, didn't speak. He simply waited. She watched him through the crack, and for the first time, she realized how much he carried alone. Protector, watchman, shadow. And as fear curled in her belly, one truth became clear. He would not let them take her. At dawn, the sound came faint, but unmistakable. Boots crunching snow. Anka held her breath, every muscle tight, heart pounding in her chest. From her hiding place, she could see only slivers of the cave, shadows moving across the entrance. Ato stood unmoving, bow in hand, an arrow already nocked. 3 figures appeared, men wrapped in hides, faces covered, weapons drawn. They didn't speak, just scanned the ground like wolves scenting prey. One stepped closer, eyes narrowing at the entrance. But Ato didn't flinch. His voice, low and cold, cut through the silence. This place is empty. A warning, not an invitation. The tallest of the strangers stepped forward, spear in hand. You travel alone? He asked, voice rough with suspicion. Ato's eyes didn't leave him. Alone enough, he said. The man sniffed, unconvinced. His gaze wandered toward the cave's interior. Ato shifted slightly, blocking the view. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man spat into the snow and turned. Nothing here. Keep moving. The others followed, their shadows retreating like poison into the wind. Only when their steps faded did Ato relax his grip. He stood for a long while, watching the trail they had taken, until even the tracks began to vanish. Anka crawled out slowly, her knees stiff, her face pale. She didn't speak, neither did Ato. But he crouched beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and steady. They won't return, he said. She nodded, but her hands trembled as she tucked the carving back into her pouch. Who were they? She whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he handed her a piece of dried meat and sat beside her, facing the wind. The silence between them held a new weight, not fear, but understanding. Whatever danger lived beyond the mountains, they would face it together. He would not let her be taken again. The days that followed were quiet, but the kind of quiet that held a storm beneath it. Ato moved carefully, always watching the sky, the wind, the trees. Anka followed his lead, her eyes sharper now, her steps more cautious. She no longer asked when they would return to her tribe. She understood now there was no return. The people who had left her behind were gone, not in distance, but in spirit. Each sunrise felt like a step away from what once was, and a step towards something unknown. And with every silent mile, she began to feel less lost. One morning, Ato handed her a small bundle, a handmade sling, a pouch of stones, a few strips of dried root. He pointed to a stump and made a motion with his hand. Throw? She missed the first time, and the second. But on the third, the stone struck with a soft thud. She smiled, surprised. He gave a single nod, and they moved on. That day, she helped carry firewood. She helped strip bark for kindling. Her hands bled, but she didn't complain. Ato never praised her aloud, but he gave her more to carry the next day. He saw her growing stronger. That night, Anka dreamt of fire, not warmth, but destruction. Flames eating through huts, people running, screaming. She stood at the edge, alone, holding the hummingbird. When she woke, sweat slicked her brow despite the cold. Ato was already awake, feeding the fire with slow, practiced movements. She didn't tell him about the dream. But when he glanced at her, something in his eyes said he knew. Without a word, he handed her a small strip of meat. She took it and sat close. Whatever ghosts haunted her sleep, she faced the morning with the fire at her back and Ato beside her. The snow thickened as they climbed higher into the Andes, the path narrowing into a single trail carved by centuries of wind and time. Ato led the way, his steps deliberate, his breath steady despite the cold. Anka followed close, the hummingbird carving tied to her wrist with a strip of cloth. She didn't stumble as often now. Her feet had learned the rhythm of the trail, and her lungs had grown strong with the thin air. When the wind turned cruel, Ato would place a steadying hand on her back. No words were needed. They moved like two parts of the same will. One morning, they found footprints, small, fresh, not animal. Anka froze, heart pounding. Ato knelt beside the tracks, studying their shape. "A child," he murmured. She stared at him, confused. "Like me?" He nodded once, then stood. "We're not alone in this mountain." That day, they moved more quickly, Ato checking the wind more often, his eyes scanning ridgelines. Anka said nothing, but her heart whispered with questions. Who else wandered these paths? Who else had been left behind? That night, as they sat beside the fire, she held the hummingbird tightly and whispered to it, as if it might carry her voice into the snow. As they watched the fire burn, Anka finally spoke what had been living in her chest for days. "Will I always be alone?" Ato didn't answer right away. He poked at the fire, watching the embers rise like stars into the cave's ceiling. Then he said, "You are not alone now." Simple words, spoken like stone. She nodded slowly, the truth of it sinking deeper than she expected. Her tribe had abandoned her, but this quiet hunter had not. In his silence, she had found more protection than a village ever gave. And in her small voice, he had found someone who still believed in warmth. By the seventh sunrise, the mountains opened into a quiet valley, untouched by war, untouched by the world. Mist curled through the trees, and warm springs steamed along the rocks. Birds called from high branches not in fear, but song. Ato led her to a stone shelter half covered in vines. It was simple, sturdy, and waiting. "This is where I stay," he said. Anka looked around, eyes wide. There was no fear in this place, no whispers of abandonment. She stepped inside, ran her hand along the stone, and turned back to him. "Can I stay too?" He nodded once. "You already have." That night, for the first time, the fire was not for survival, it was for comfort. Anka sat beside Ato, eating slowly, watching the flames dance without dread. She didn't flinch at the shadows anymore. She didn't sleep with one eye open. Her body had begun to trust the ground beneath her. Ato carved quietly beside her, shaping another bird from a block of wood. When he handed it to her, she smiled. "For your stories," he said. Her fingers wrapped around it like a promise. The hummingbird still hung at her wrist, a memory of what she survived, not what she lost. As the stars emerged above the valley, Anka turned to Ato and asked softly, "What does Anka mean?" He looked at her, then at the sky. "In the old tongue, it means eagle." She blinked. "But I had the hummingbird." He smiled gently. "The hummingbird survives the storm. The eagle rises above it." She was silent for a long time, then nodded. That night, wrapped in fur and surrounded by peace, Anka closed her eyes and slept without fear, without cold. She was no longer the girl left behind. She was the one who lived, who learned, and who was finally found. In the heart of the Andes, where cold winds carry silence and snow swallows footprints, a story was written not with words, but with firelight, patience, and quiet strength. Anka was left behind, abandoned by those who once called her kin, but she was not broken. In Ato, the silent hunter, she found more than survival. She found trust, belonging, and the beginnings of healing. This was never just a story about escaping the cold. It was about rising from the ashes of abandonment. It was about how sometimes the people who find us in our darkest hour, strangers, quiet protectors become the family we never expected. Anka was not the same girl who sat alone beneath a tree in the snow. She was stronger now, not because the storm had passed, but because she had learned to walk through it. What did you feel while listening to Anka and Otto's journey? Did a moment in the story speak to your heart? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.